how can it be that these people, on the day their child is born, could anyone imagine trying to sort of prevent access for the child to that parent? And the things we were looking at were flexible working, which I know is much easier now, because if you and I were together and we were separating, then your routine needs to change. And you know that you've been through it as well. And somebody suddenly you have to pick up the kids when you didn't, and that kind of stuff. So the easier it's about creating the right path that people could start to separate well. For me, you could strip out most of the friction, I'd say, in the system of nuance, and just say, look, it's going to be roughly, basically, this is the formula. Should we agree that now? We could deviate slightly, and then if there's a big issue and the safeguarding, you go to court, and that would do it.
Hi, my name's Andrew Payne, host of the podcast Men On Show. I'm delighted to have another fantastic guest here today, James Hayhurst. So career-wise, very much in the creative and marketing space. We may touch on that briefly, but we're really here to talk about his amazing initiative, The Parents' Promise. That's what we really want to be focusing on, exploring the topic of relationship breakdown and trying to co-parent when things are really tough, trying to be a father figure in that scenario. So, James, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A pleasure to be here.
Cool. So, just before we jump into learning about the Parents' Promise, I really want to hear about that. It touches on me as well, very closely. It's a topic very close to my heart. Just tell us a little bit about your work today. What's the Magic Source course? If anybody stumbles across you, they'll be like, "Oh, what's that to do with?"
On LinkedIn, yeah. Well, certainly that gives a good intro, a very quick précis to my career, which is spent most of my life in advertising agencies for my sins, and then I became a marketeer at Unilever. So the Magic Source course is about helping ad agencies, and big marketing clients work better together in a
Okay.
relationship sense, actually. Um, and the advertising kind of creative industry background is relevant to the Parents' Promise in how we've approached stimulating this conversation in wider society. So, well, no doubt comes to
Yeah.
that in a sec. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, I mean, let's talk about the Parents' Promise.
Well,
Um, I think for our listeners, well, what is it? How has it come about? Yeah, tell us about it.
yeah. So, the Parents' Promise is a sort of social initiative and an idea that launched in 2021 around helping the UK to separate better and have a different conversation around separation. And before I explain what it actually is, the principles behind it and the thinking was that I think, like you, as we're going to maybe come to touch on, had an experience in terms of relationship breakdown and the family courts, and just generally observed that this was something we don't talk about as a society, and a lot of things really, really don't work. And there were certain prejudices that I had around this subject that I wanted to kind of dispel. And the prejudices I had were, firstly, I never thought I'd get separated. That happens to other people. And then secondly, I assumed, I was aware of these blokes that dressed up as Batman or whatever, and I sort of assumed that um, they must have done something to not be seeing their children. That was kind of because up to my generally the UK seemed to work, so I couldn't imagine why there was how it could be that it was possible for a parent, a loving and safe parent, not to see a child. I'm sure we'll get into this later, but ultimately, what my observation, pretty simple one, was it's become so gender toxic, this subject, that despite how damaging it is to children, and despite the judiciary and most MPs, most of them understanding the problems, they find it very hard to sort of address the issue, because it's just, you just get shouted down from the start. So to begin to answer your question, the approach for the Parents' Promise was, I was trying to think of, firstly, there seemed to be a role for communication. That's what we talk about in advertising. There's a role for a different kind of conversation. And would it be possible maybe to create something that was almost impossible to disagree with, which is what the Parents' Promise is? And then, is it possible to bring lots of organizations together around this cause? Because I was aware of the two extremes, Women's Aid and Fathers for Justice, just to to paint a couple of examples that were sort of shouting at each other, but yet there were tens of organisations child-centred. I'm not saying that those aren't that could move the conversation forward if we could get them together. So a couple of things we did. Firstly, we would create an alliance called the Positive Parenting Alliance, and then we launched this idea called the Parents' Promise, which is really a prenup. It's not a legal document, although it may become one, and there's some law firms that want to take us up on maybe making it something a bit more belt and braces and robust. But essentially, the thought I had was, it's possible if you're rich to have prenups around things that don't really matter, the material possessions, but nobody ever seems to talk about the most important thing, which is the relationship with the kids. And I remember thinking, wow, how can it be that these people, on the day their child is born, could anyone imagine trying to sort of prevent access for the child to that parent, all the kind of the rubbish you hear around the family court? So wouldn't it be nice, wouldn't it be maybe a game-changing conversation to commit to each other that no matter what happens in your own relationship, you will always do what's right for the child? So we'll no doubt link to the Parents Promise website in kind of show notes and what have you. But yeah, if you've got the parentspromise.org.uk, there is the promise that you can look at and download to discuss with your partner. And the three disarmingly simple things that we want you to promise are that whatever happens, that you will always make sure that your children have lots of time with you and your wider families, that you will always be nice and kind to each other, and that you will always work together to create the right conditions, because for your children to thrive, because it's a very organic process being a parent, and you both need to work together. And you may not be together in terms of in a relationship, but you're both the parents of the children, and they need you both. So that's the Parents' Promise in a fairly long-winded way. It was a prenup and a conversation starter, because we launched with a survey. We discovered that something like 90% of us parents have actually talked about and thought about what we'll do if we win the lottery, which sadly is never going to happen. But less than 5% of any couple, any parenting couple, had ever talked really about separation and what might happen. And of course, there's reasons for that. It's not a pretty subject to discuss. But with 40 to 50% of couples ending in separation, it felt like a dangerous conversation not to be having. So that's it.
No,
That's the Parents' Promise.
absolutely. And I mean, just when I think about, we'll talk about data shortly. When I think about the guys that I know, understanding that when things go wrong, post relationship, it's not always that a mum is blocking the dad from seeing the kid. It can be a
No.
two-way thing. Sometimes there are safeguarding issues. I get that, but I wonder whether, as well, from your experience, whether part of the difficulty when relationships break down is that the intention is, well, of course, for the sake of the children, it'll be fine, we'll be nice to each other. It hasn't worked out. But the reality is that the difficulties really kick off when one of the partners now has a new romantic interest, and there's either a new father figure around the kids or a new motherly figure around the kids that seems to really kick these problems off. Do you see a link there from your work so far that things really go downhill when a new romantic interest, or do you find that in most cases actually things have been going downhill in terms of the parents getting on post relationship
Yeah,
long before one of them starts dating again?
I think it's a real mix. And I think the issue is, I think most parents, again, safeguarding issues notwithstanding, the huge majority of parents would not want to do anything that damaged their children. And I think what isn't appreciated is that, that separation, if it's not done well, I mean, clearly as a kid, I mean, my parents are still together, but you want your parents to be together. But if you are able to separate well, and it's definitely possible, then children can thrive, and it can be the best for everybody. I don't think there's the appreciation in broader society that parents parental conflict, and that's the wrong term really, but that it is incredibly, incredibly damaging for children. And we're totally kind of blind to that. And I think that feeds then into, if you're not aware of that, and that's what the parents' promise is really around, was we were just thinking, if you get married in a wherever you get married, but say you get married in a church or registry office, there's that moment when the person marrying you says, well, you're going to support this couple on their journey, and everyone says yes and hooray, which is brilliant. But the thought that we had was, okay, well, when you separate, firstly acknowledging that it's hard to separate well, but actually praising those that do, because it's the best thing you can do for your kids. And with the parents' promise, we're sort of almost thinking it would be brilliant if the best man and chief bridesmaid signed that too and kept you honest, because it may be that clearly, whether it's super amicable or whether there's some issues, what tends to happen is parties split off into groups and it kind of makes it worse. And what we want is for people to be saying, and for society to realize that, yeah, okay, it's hard this, but you really need to separate well for the best outcome for your children. And I think if people realize that, a bit like we're starting to realize with phones, like how damaging they can be, there's been a change, and we're not there with separation.
No,
So I think that would.
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, no. So with the parents' promise, it seems to me what you're saying, one aim is that this is taken up, enshrined as much as it can be
Yeah,
in law. So when people sign it,
yeah,
presumably it has some kind of influencing factor within the family courts,
yeah,
within mediation. And I'm presuming here, so correct me if I'm wrong, part of your other thing with the parents' promise, what you want to achieve is just to get people talking about it more,
yeah,
perhaps than they are.
yeah. I think it's about changing culturally. I think that's the most powerful thing, behavior change level. If we all know that separating well is good and separating badly is damaging to your kids, then far fewer people would do that. And then finally, to go to back to your actual question you asked about new partners and stuff, I think because people don't realize that, then of course there are triggers that, ultimately we're all wounded little kids inside, without turning this into a therapy session. And I think that, yeah, that does happen. So then people, you know, parents actually end up acting like children, and they
Yeah.
feel hurt and stuff happens, and then and when lawyers get involved, it becomes harder and harder and harder. And I suppose people think, okay, well, little Johnny needs me more than he needs this other person, and and we tend to, I think we tend to, talk to some child psychologists as well, we tend to we understand, or we underappreciate how much our kids understand everything. So we don't think our behavior is making a difference, or they're not noticing everything, and they are noticing everything. So there's a lot of stories and some real horror stories of people I've got to know who, you know, that things have gone really downhill when they've met a new partner years later.
Wow.
And it shouldn't even be a thing. So
So, well, what about the HR initiative? What's
yeah,
that? You mentioned that, I know, when we were discussing this and we sort of first got in contact.
yeah.
Where does that fit into this?
So yeah, so we launched the promise in 2021, and then every couple of years we try and do something in culture to make a difference, like an actual thing.
Yeah.
So rather than maybe talk a lot of hot air, can we actually do something which will make a difference? And the first thing we did of note was we observed that in HR policy in general, there are lots of great HR policies in the last kind of 5 years dealing with really important things, whether that's miscarriages or all sorts of bereavements. Really, but we realized there was nothing around separation, and I changed my career slightly upon my divorce. I was running an ad agency, and for various reasons, I've decided I'd go the other side after that. It's a bit better work-life balance, etc., etc. Both my CEO, the ad agency, and Unilever, who I went to work for, were wonderful. But there was never a policy. So they were wonderful because my line manager was wonderful. And it just seemed to be a blocker. So what we thought we'd do is, and post COVID, it was much easier, was wouldn't it be great if firms and companies had a bespoke HR policy, which just collecting things they probably do anyway under a little subhead, so that if you were separating, they could point you to that. And the things we were looking at were flexible working, which I know is much easier now, because if you and I were together and we were separating, then your routine needs to change, and you know that because you've been through it as well. And somebody suddenly you have to pick up the kids when you didn't, and that kind of stuff. So the easier it was about creating the right path that people could start to separate well. So there was some practical stuff, linking people to counselling. It's a big deal getting separated. It doesn't just happen and then it kind of then it's over 2 months later. And then we produce some resources with good information because again, culturally, we don't know much about separation. We tend to think you need to go to family court. And there's almost too much bad information online. So we produced some resources and pulled from our various charities and support partners so that people could get the right information most quickly. And then finally, just helping line managers and people talk about this because it's quite an awkward thing to raise, and you feel kind of pretty shamey and you failed. So to stimulate the conversation, and it was brilliant. We got an MP supported us, Siobhan Bailey, and we got 8 huge companies, Tesco being the biggest, that signed up January 2023. So nearly 1 million employees were positively affected, and we were delighted by that as an outcome.
That is brilliant. And I suppose, yeah, when I talk about, well, what can companies do? What could employers do to help people? And I think of, we hear is a very sort of jargony phrase, your employee, the EAPs, your employee
Yeah, oh yeah,
assistance program. Actually, for organizations to understand. So for me, having been through the family courts, a big problem, I was fortunate when I was going through it that I had quite a flexible employer.
mm,
But if your case, people who may not know this if they've not yet experienced the family courts, if your case is listed for 9 a.m. in the morning
oh,
as a half an hour hearing, you might think, well, I need to get half a day of annual leave sorted for that because I'll be back by lunchtime because my office is only round the corner from the family courts. You won't be back by lunchtime. If your case is heard by 2 o'clock, it will be a minor miracle.
yeah,
You could be in there an hour, although it was listed for half an hour, or maybe you'll be in there for 2 minutes because there's a piece of
mm,
paperwork that's missing. Oh, by the way, that's a waste of your money having the barrister there for that whole
yeah,
day for the 2 minutes that you're in
yeah,
court. And so, likewise, then CAFCAS, the organisation that advises judges on what they should do, the CAFCAS officers obviously get to know the case, or so they theoretically they
yeah,
do. They when they call you, if they call you for one of a fact-finding conversation, you could be on the phone to them for 10 minutes or 2 hours. Your solicitor could need information like that. And so for me, I think what you touch on with flexible employment is really, I think there's a conversation for employers. They need to understand what the family courts are actually like when you go through them. Because all the time you want to be a reliable employee. You need the money because you're being absolutely scammed in the financial courts. Not scammed, but you know what I mean. So I think there is a whole piece that needs to be
yep.
that, policies, procedures are 100%. Was that your experience of the family courts? Was that just mine?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll come to family court in a sec. I'll just to your point, to your first point about how hard it is to keep going work wise, and this was it was really easy to have these conversations around with the HR leaders because they were all like, "Oh my God, I can't believe we don't do this." And it was an open door. But essentially, we obviously usually launch for surveys. We discovered, not unsurprisingly, I think like 90% of people surveyed said that separating had affected their ability to work. It affected their mental health. Lots of people had to change careers or felt they had to change careers. I think 95% had said that it affected their mental health. Nearly 40% had
Which
taken
survey
time
was
off
this?
work.
Was this a survey that you carried out, James?
Yeah, a survey. We did a survey at round launch in January 23.
How many
So
people roughly did you survey?
it would have been in the hundreds. I've got the precise amount, but
Interesting.
it was and it was one of those things that becomes I think and less than 10% had any specific policy. And what we
Wow.
discovered was therefore it was a bit of a no-brainer because you don't, work generally is a good thing and it helps your mental health to keep working. And a lot of people will give more to work during the dark times because essentially you're clinging on to what you know. So it was a real win-win. Is the press have misreported this a little bit. We got a lot of coverage on a lot of the morning shows about it's divorce leave and time off work. It was really about understanding what your person's going through, To your point, lots of people said they had to leave their jobs because they have to. You can't not go to family court. You can't not do these. They're so important. So it allows people to just do what they're doing, and you kind of, as an employee, you get payback because people feel incredibly grateful and they're able to continue doing what they need to do. But yes, the family court is it's just not a good experience on a whole host of levels. It's very expensive. It's just not the right place to go, really. I think people think that you see it on telly, or maybe you see it in the States, that someone will make a decision, the right decision, and like justice will be done, if you've been slighted or something like this happens. And it's just not a good experience all round. I can go into a rabbit hole about how bad it is. Sometimes you've got no choice, and sometimes there are sort of real safeguarding issues that you need courts. But ultimately, there's a lot of middle class or no safety concerned people ending up in courts because they think they have to, or they get dragged there. Is not good for anybody. It's incredibly expensive, and it's not good for your kids.
Yeah, and
They're,
obviously you touch on this that, and I think people often aren't aware of this when they start their proceedings, is that you could spend an absolute fortune and a whole ton of stress, months of your time, and an agreement is made or a court order is made, but then the other person may not adhere to it,
yeah,
and then try, well, we'll race back to court. Then you won't be racing back to court. The wheels of the court system turn very, very slowly.
yeah,
So it's a very unsatisfactory experience. And I had the privilege of speaking to Jackie Chiotto, who's the CEO of CAFCAS, this independent
yeah,
organization. They advise the judges what to do, as you'll be aware. But they've got like 1,400 caseworkers across the UK. So within that group, of course, you've got old school black and white thinkers who probably need to retire, and sometimes they'll be brilliant and insightful. So it is a bit of a lottery. You don't know who you're going to get. The judge I got in my second time round at court just had a very fixed opinion that the reason my daughters were not seeing their mum had to be down to me because that just wouldn't happen, and would not deviate from that kind of mantra aside from the evidence that was put forward. So these are, how do we make the family courts work better though? I mean, obviously we ideally want couples to not end up in the family courts,
yeah.
but do you what can we do within the family courts, do you think?
If I had a magic wand, I would say there's two things either end of this. Firstly, if you can create societal change, then people will realise they shouldn't go there, and they'll separate better. That's the biggest thing. So reduce, it's the demand supply thing, isn't it? Reduce that. Um, Ultimately, it's under resourced, and there's all sorts of, you said, subjectivity within the court. The big thing I would do at the very sharp end, and you referenced this, Andrew, is make court orders legally enforceable, and they are officially, but they never are. So what happens is that if one party doesn't want to adhere to what the court's saying, there's very little that is ever done, and that is at that end where all the real damage gets done. And there's lots of horror stories where you know judges after 10 years, I think Judge Stephen Wildblood is a good example. He's just retired, of just sort of saying, you know, he released a case where I think the child was so damaged and it was a teenager. Now he's, essentially said he should go to parent A, but the damage has been done. There's nothing I can do, and
Yeah.
they're going to stay with parent B. And I think because because these orders aren't enforced in parenting terms, having done a few parenting courses, from what I remember, you don't want to be a permissive parent, and which basically you just let the kid get away with it for as long as possible. You don't want to be authoritarian. You want to be authoritative. And for me, the court is permissive, and that's the problem. It may be only a relatively small minority, but that's where a lot of the damage is done in these long running cases. And it seems bizarre maybe to people listening to this, is how can a court order not be enforceable? You get parking tickets get enforced and TV license payments get enforced. This surely, but it just isn't. And
Yeah.
that's what when people often want to pick my brains about when they're starting out in this, I think that's a big caution. Is this is not just going to get sorted. and try and be as amicable as you can.
Yeah, there were a couple of things that really concerned me, I suppose. One of them, just to add to what you said, we were able to prove time and time again in both of my family court sagas that my ex was lying. It was there on paper, but it didn't seem to have any impact on the judge or their thinking.
Mm,
There seemed to be no sense of telling her not to lie. The judge just didn't seem bothered. And that concerns me that there doesn't seem to be as much concern on sort of perjury as there would in a criminal court. And of course, we don't know how long the judges, read all the paperwork. It's very hard to find that information. But sort of the solicitors and barristers that I talked to were saying, well, a judge probably won't have more than 6 or 7 minutes. And you're like, yeah, but we've spent months preparing these bundles, preparing the paperwork. There's no way anyone could read that in six
mm,
minutes. So my concern, I suppose, is it's quite arbitrary. People are allowed to lie. It doesn't seem, as you say, court orders are not particularly enforceable. And you reference this, because they're so over run with cases and not enough resource. Judges, how can they get to know a case, the
mm.
intricacies of a case,
Yeah.
in no time at all?
Yeah, they can't. And yeah, they said this huge, for those who've not done a bundle, I can see them behind you, these lever arch files, if anyone's
Yeah.
watching on YouTube. They're huge documents, and it just, yeah, there's just an awful lot of time, money, and energy wasted when, yeah, you just ultimately, again, how would you solve these things? I think there are rules, rough rules. It doesn't need to be 50-50, but in theory, again, if I had a magic wand, when you separate, back to the parents promise, kids should see a lot of both parents. And for me, you could strip out most of the friction, I'd say, in the system of nuance and just say, look, it's going to be roughly, basically, this is the formula. Should we agree that now? We could deviate slightly, and then if there's a big issue and the safeguarding, you go to court, and that would do it. There's kind of like I don't think family lawyers are bad people. I think it's a bad system. You could argue till the cows come home about what's in the best interests of a child, and actually what's in the best interest of the child is roughly what's in the parent's promise. So we've overcomplicated something, and what's damaging, I think there's two big things. One is the cases that, maybe, as I said, maybe something that you went through where they just should never have gone to the court, but it had to go there. And then there's also real safeguarding concern cases, with domestic violence, DV, children in danger. They need the court time, they need the expert time, and I suspect, I know a lot of that time is going to cases that shouldn't be there. So there's a real imperative to change this on those two levels at least.
And what are your thoughts on parental alienation? Often, when I speak about men's well-being and I touch on fatherhood, most people have heard the term, but most people that haven't experienced the family courts are a bit
Mm,
vague as to what it is. You mentioned Fathers for Justice, Women's Aid. My view of what Women's Aid would think is that they would see it as a male construct used to bash women, whereas Fathers for Justice would see it as a very real thing, probably more with women guilty of it the men. What do you make of parental alienation? Is it junk science, as some people say? Is it bone of what would you say? How would you explain what it is and its impact?
yeah, again, I suppose for those that aren't aware, it's about when a child's relationship is meaningfully and kind of manipulatively damaged with a parent, and you'd think it's not possible for those that are listening. Hopefully, happily in a relationship and with loving kids, you couldn't imagine that your child would ever not want to see you. Um, but sadly, it's if you speak to any of the main charities, there is an epidemic of whatever you want to call it. The problem is that the term's been demonized, which I think is a tactic, and it's not something I talk about massively or we focus on as part of the parents' promise. But there are many, I know many mums and dads who simply do not see their children, and it's heartbreaking. So I think we need to get to a stage where we, as grown-ups, talk about the issue, because there's the two big things that are really dangerous in breakups. One is domestic violence, which is again nothing I've experienced, but is huge. And there's also kids being turned against their parents, which again is highly damaging. Isn't noticed often for 10, 15, 20 years because the child doesn't really know what's happening. and it's important. I think we're maybe getting there slowly. That everyone, because we're all focused around children, that you can have a proper conversation because both things happen, and you need to solve for both of them. I think that's the issue, and hopefully we're getting to a position where we're starting to have just calmer conversations. I mean, this is about children's health, and we need to have serious, proper conversations around that. Is what I'd say.
Yeah. See, for me, with parental alienation, just to sort of add, there's a sense of parents not seeing their kids, which you touch on and mention. I do also think that part of parental alienation is the bad mouthing
Yeah.
of parents. So when my daughters used to live with their mum before they were moved, their residency was moved, after she blocked my contact, alleged kidnap threats, and I took it to court to get contact back because I'd had all direct contact. Taken, and the courts moved residency. But long before it all went to court, I would pick up the girls for a weekend of contact, and they'd say in the car on the way back to my house in Birmingham, "Why'd you shout at mummy in the week on the phone? You really upset her." And I'm like, trying to think, well, I literally have had one conversation with your mum on the phone in the week. And I asked her for some, it was an extra day of half term, something like that. And she said that she wasn't going for it. And as I always did, I just capitulated straight away. I would always ask and respectfully lose. I always tried to keep the peace. We just had like a reasonable conversation. I didn't shout at her. But unfortunately now I've got to explain, well, I didn't. Well, who's the liar then? And then you can start to get into some very dangerous territory around, well, what is alienating? How do I find that line between being honest with the kids and not bad mouthing mum? And I know I've mentioned this to you when we spoke. My 9-year-old daughter once asked me, and her father to daughter just before bedtime used to have a little bit of a chat on the weekends that I had them. Why does mummy always lie? That's now really difficult to answer that without bad mouthing mum. Because if I say she doesn't lie, that's a lie. If I say mummy loves you, well, that just doesn't answer the question. So there is complexity with parental alienation. You could have people that are accused of it, and actually they're just really dealing with a complex situation, whereas other people are very proactive in trying to break down that
Mm.
relationship. But that's what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, ultimately, it's a politician's answer here, but just going back to the parents' promise is like if we're able to hold ourselves to lots of contact and being nice to each other and working together, then that's going to create the best conditions possible for a child to not be damaged. And clearly, there's going to be some fallout from a separation. And yeah, there's quite a lot of literature which if people are interested, there's some academics I'm sure you can put there. Dr. Ben Hine, Professor Ben Hine's really good to follow, but they do proper science on this. But and I'm no psychologist, but there's lots of things that happen where children, yeah, far too young, and probably we're all far too young to ever be caught into this. They start to be let into their parents' relationship in a way which just isn't healthy. So there are loads of sort of things. I think there's a checklist. There's 17 signs of alienating behaviour. They're all worth having a look at um, for those interested. And you just kind of the point maybe I made at the start is your children will be hypersensitive to everything, and as hard as it is to separate well, it's really important to try and do that. And to your point, it then becomes if one party is not doing that, it's really hard because you're then caught in this tailspin because there are questions that you're not really sure how to answer because you can't ignore them. And so yeah, and ideally we'd never start,
Yeah,
and
but
we'd
it
be in
seems
the
like,
utopia.
yeah, what you're saying is quite reasonable though, because it seems
Yeah,
like with the parents' promise, your hope for this, you're not saying that will it will take out so many cases that the
yeah,
family courts would cease to exist. You're saying hopefully with the parents' promise, your goal is that it would reduce the numbers of families that are there that probably don't need to be there.
yeah,
It's just got a bit carried away, and actually
yeah,
both parents could be
yeah,
coached and
yeah,
coaxed and coached away from it. Maybe if they thought about it more and
yeah.
talked about it more. Where do you, so you mentioned obviously Dr. Ben Hine in terms of psychology. Where's the research on, or is there research on children's mental health through that family court process? Is that stuff that you touch on?
I mean, there's a whole lack of the lack of data in the family courts is shocking. You'll get more of a follow up if you buy a dishwasher from Curry's. And it's something I sort of bang on about quite a lot. Is I think it's still paper based, incredibly. If your children go through the court, no one is. Firstly, they shouldn't go to court, and this is a health issue. But like if you went to the doctors, there should be a follow up, and how's the child doing? Is the setup right? All of those things. None of that stuff happens. So there is just very, very little data. So therefore, nothing ever changes, and also the magnitude of the problem falls over. So, sorry, is never seen. So again, if you look at things like phones and all the work that Jonathan Haidt has done, which for the anxious generation, he has done written an amazing book, and that you've got the smartphone free childhood has sprung up as a result of saying, look, we can see this, we can see the damage that's being done to children by smartphones. It's pretty irrefutable now, and parents are starting to change. I think it's probably a lifelong piece of work, but I think if society realised that separating badly was so damaging, then a lot of the cases wouldn't go to the court. But I think we're totally blind. We're totally blind to the damage of separation in culture. So it's still all kind of glamorized around courts. Maybe slightly random example, but I think it's important to make a point. Mrs. Doubtfire, the film, which I've never seen, but I've heard. I know the story. I mean, that essentially is about, I think, one parent trying to stop the other parent seeing the kids, and Robin Williams has to dress up and like that. If that flipped and that was a story about domestic violence, that wouldn't be on the West End. It's really damaging behaviour that I think we just think it's normal. We think it's normal that mummy or daddy and daddy or daddy, or if you're in the same sex relationship, if they're going to fall out when they separate, and you just have to deal with it. And my hope is that maybe in 15, 20 years' time, it's a bit like now when we watch episodes of Friends and we go, oh God, there are some things you just can't say now. Rightly so, society's changed. I still think there's almost complete blind spot around separation and the damage. I don't know if you agree, Andrew, but that's where I think we are. And I think if we can change that, if socially a parent, if a parent was just hanging out with their mates and they're saying, why hasn't your child seen the mum or dad for 6 months? That's not cool, is it? Social shame and that kind of social pressure is quite a big deal. Whereas at the moment, we don't have any of that. It's just, he had an affair, so I'm not going to let him see the effing kids. Well, that's not fair on the kids, even if that was the case.
I mean, this, like I say, this is close to my heart. We're both working in a space that, I mean, for you, it's much more men and women. My focus is on men, although of course
Yeah,
people struggle with this, and I've really so a few things. Parents promise, more people talking about the issue to create awareness about separating well and the impact of not doing it well. Perhaps within that, the reality of what the family courts are actually like, and it's completely arbitrary. So that's a good start. Employers doing more, becoming aware of this problem, and perhaps reflecting that in policies and procedures. And obviously, the Parents' Promise initiative is something that you're going to hope kickstarts at, so that if people have thought about it and know what the family courts potentially are like, hopefully it might strip out some cases to take the pressure off the family courts, which would then help those cases where it is really,
yeah,
really complicated. Like my case was complicated, and you put in some mental health issues with another parent or a destructive parent. There was never going to be an easy way to solve that. With the family courts, I wonder whether, and I know that, and I don't know where we're up to with this. So I'm talking just as I'm thinking here, which is
yeah.
never a good sign because then I just talk and talk and talk. Tell me to shut up if I go on too long.
Hello.
Is that just some transparency in how decisions are made. We don't have that at the moment, and I am aware of calls for some kind of transparency, accountability on how decisions are made. And maybe that would help if judges knew they were accountable, that the information was going to be more public, whether that's in terms of anonymous data. But
Yeah,
as you say, it's very hard. As I say, I'm trying to find out. I put every question imaginable through the AI models onto how long a judge spends reading a case and got absolutely nothing back. There should be some best practice guidelines there that people are aware of.
Yeah, I would agree. I think back to there is there is a formula for this. As in, without when there's no safeguarding issues, parents should see their kids a lot. Whether that's 60, whether the boundary, and you need to not go for 50-50 if you can't, and it needs to not be a kind of sort of a turf war. But what a lot of time with your child, maybe the boundary is 70-30. This was my family court. So that's the thing. You may say, do you know what? I was the breadwinner. I'm still gonna have a stressful job. I can see them 30% of the time. But at the same point, if a parent wants 50 and can do it, or just then I'd say, look, that just has to be what it is. That would reduce a lot of the issues. But to your point, yeah, there should just be some standard rules, and then you kind of know where you are, because it does vary, and that then I think breeds well, it just adds complexity, and then people then make a case about why that why they need to see why half term 6 days for them or one for the other. It just allows people to argue about stuff that's not gonna sort of benefit your children.
So
But
how
then
do yeah, so go on, carry on. No, you carry on.
the data point of view, I think if you were to if it existed where I think it's less about judges being evil or making mistakes necessarily. I think it can be certainly can be made more uniform. But if there were data, which there will be, just it's not we haven't got it, that says, look, do you know what? We've looked at the cohort of kids that went through family court and where the orders didn't hold or where it was really traumatic. And guess what? But 5 months later, 5 years later, this is where we're on the mental health. There's an amazing report launched yesterday, I think, just sort of date our conversation slightly by Brendan Cox's foundation around the mental health of boys and girls generally together more in common. And I just think if you had those data around children that have been through the court, you would see the issues and everyone would race to stop it. So that's what I think the problem is. It's like we can't see, you know, imagine take it, it's like, if it was in physical health, if you give, very simply, if these children went on this program and look 6 months later, half of them are really sad and it's not, you wouldn't give them that pill, would you? And I think if we have that follow up, it'd make a huge difference.
Yeah, wonderful. So just to conclude the podcast, there's two things I always ask. One is where can people find you?
Yeah, can I add one plug as well before in terms of
Please do.
the
Please
next
do.
thing the next thing we're going to do, which will have happened, I think, by the time this launches, is we're going to look at separation in schools. So early in September, or we're going to launch our sort of second big initiative, which is a really important area um, for your kids, which is school. Which if things are rocky at home, then that should be a safe place for you. And what we're discovering, and again, you may have some personal perspective on this, that is that often parents take their disagreements to and through school. So we've got a survey which we'll launch next week, which shows that 58% of teachers have seen this and reporting on the bad behaviours they have to deal with and how stressful it is for teachers. And then we've also discovered a lack of training for teachers, so it's not their fault. Um, but I think only a third of schools have any kind of separation policy. Less than I think 15% have had any training at all in this area, and less than 5% know about the legal aspects, which means that a parent can say something to the school and the teacher's caught in the middle and then doesn't know how to react and what to do. So we're producing a load of resources that will land on September the 9th that will hopefully make a big difference. And again, if we can start to use schools as a bit of a buffer for parents, say, look, you really need to separate well, certainly in this environment for your child, because the other thing the teachers say is they see the mental health issues and they say the academic performance and the attendance drop, then we think that will make quite a big difference. So that's on our life's journey, on my life's journey, that's a pretty excited about hopefully that as a way of making change at a really important point for children.
That is literally fantastic. That is really
Brilliant.
exciting to hear that. So great job, and wish you the best with that. So first of all, how do people connect with you? You're doing some fantastic work. How do they follow you and get involved? And yeah,
Yeah.
where can
So best thing, obviously, the website is parentspromise.org.uk. And there you can download the promise and look at what we're up to. I'm not on loads of social media, but I'm on LinkedIn. So the best one is to search me on LinkedIn to James Hayhurst. Should come up. There's not too many James Hayhurst in the world, so you should find me there. And then we do, yeah, they'll be the main two.
Okay. And I always ask this of all guests on every topic imaginable that we've discussed. Can you give our listeners a two sort of sentence message of hope? Three sentences is fine, by the way, but just a short, concise message of hope just to round the podcast off with.
I think this is an incredibly solvable issue. It's an issue that affects thousands of children every year. And if we can start to educate ourselves as loving parents as to how to behave differently in this stressful situation, we can really help the next generation. It's
So
within our grasp.
yeah, so to paraphrase, separating badly is a solvable issue, generally speaking.
Exactly.
Yeah, perfect. James, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. You're doing such important work. Please keep up that good work and thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.